Alright, this is the Psilo book review number 2. This time it is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is also a Watermill classic, and it was about 147 pages. This book only took me 1 day to read, but I had more time than I did than the Around the World in 80 Days, which took me a week. I had only spent about an hour each day for Around the World in 80 Days, whereas this book probably spent a good 4 hours on it. It was a good book. It kept me going. I had never read this book before or even heard of it, although I've read War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I've also read The Invisible Man a long time ago by H.G. Wells. So it's interesting. I've never heard of his first book, which is The Time Machine. I'm not sure if this book ever became a movie, but I'm sure there were adaptations of this book that were created. Anyways, first category was characters. I gave it a 75 out of 100. And the characters were pretty interesting. They took on a lot of different personalities, although they didn't really use names in this book. For example, the main character is just the time traveler or time traveler. His friends that are in the book, or the people he meets with to speak about time traveling, their names are also just occupations, such as the psychologist, journalist, I believe there's doctor. So it's mostly just different psychologies of people for the characters. And as they speak, they give that off as well through their points of view. Yeah, the main character is really interesting. He was quite wise. He was always patient with the others' point of view and very scientific in the way that he spoke when he was describing time as a dimension. He says that it's like a similar dimension as height, width, and depth, and that it can actually be traveled in a similar way. And he tries to explain it using the same terms that the medical person would understand, or the same terms that the psychologist would understand. The author's diction was also interesting because it was almost first person. It was like spoken from the point of view of the time traveler and everything that happened to him. It's as if he's telling the story for most of the book. So I gave it a 80 out of 100 for the author's diction, mostly for the point of view, the way that he describes the future times. This book takes place in the year 802,701, and the author really does a good job of describing this future time, as well as the cultures of the types of people that live in this future time. So I gave the setting a 90 out of 100. For that reason, it was the only thing that was more interesting to me right now than the Around the World in 80 Days as far as setting would have probably been this book, because the 1800s was interesting for me. But even more so, I think this year, 802,000, way into the future, was even more interesting for me to read. The conflict, out of 100, I gave it an 85. There was more action in this book than the previous book that I read, Around the World in 80 Days. While there were some gunfights in Around the World, The Time Machine definitely took the award for more action type scenes. There were definitely fights using weapons. There were times having to use fire, makeshift from the materials that he had around him, such as, I think he was trying to make a bomb. He wasn't able to find the gunpowder or find the chemicals he needed, but just the idea of that was interesting to me. It seemed more creative, a little more exciting as far as conflict goes. For resolution, I gave it a 75 out of 100. So I gave it a higher score on conflict than Around the World in 80 Days, but a lower score on resolution. That was because I think sometimes how the problems were solved was not as creative as Around the World in 80 Days. So I gave it a slightly lower score. Sometimes the solution would simply be him reaching into his pocket to realize he had a few matches left. So that was a little underwhelming sometimes. But it still kept me on my toes, especially the fact that there would be like danger about to approach the main character, and he just passes through time using the time machine. So yeah, that was an interesting way to escape danger, is just staying still and moving forward in time. So yeah, that was a surprise, I would say. So moving on to the next category, which is surprises. I give it an 80 out of 100. There were a lot of things I didn't expect, especially when they're talking about the two main races that live on the planet Earth. For a long time, he thinks there's only one, right? He sees the Eloi, who live in the light on the surface. But later on in the story, he meets the Morlocks, which live in total darkness underground, and they're more ape-like. The way they describe them reminded me almost like a Yeti. They move very quickly, and yeah, it was interesting. I had just seen the movie The Planet of the Apes, the original one, and in the second one, there were an underground society that was connected to the old human race as well. So it made me make a lot of connections, and it also was symbolic for classism, potentially racism, or just the separation between the industrial class or the wealthy class, or the worker class, and then the rich. So as far as symbolism goes, or symbology, I gave it a 90 out of 100. Obviously, when you're going underground, it's almost like you're going into the shadows, right? You're going into They call it the dark night of the soul, or facing the side of yourself that you may have ignored. In this story, it's the human race has been split into two, almost like the left-hand path, right-hand path, left side of the brain, right side of the brain. So it's really a part where he has to face that other side. So I think because of that, there was a lot of symbolic knowledge. And another category itself was knowledge, which I also gave a 90 out of 100, mostly because it gives some of the history of what led to this future society, whether it be pursuing the advancements of technology to the point where the rich class ended up becoming so out of touch, so lazy, that they don't remember even how to survive on their own. They ended up becoming almost like cattle, because it's so many generations forward, they don't remember how they even got to this state of grace. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons definitely within this book. Keeps you thinking about future times. Since it takes place so much in the future, it's more of a looking forward than a looking back. And it makes you think about your own society to make sure we don't follow in the same footsteps or go on a similar path. The next category is lessons. I gave it a 90 out of 100 as well. For a lot of the reasons I just said, it makes you contemplate the direction we're headed as a society. It also gives you a wonder into the future of the Earth. There are a lot of scenes where he's getting towards the end days of the Earth itself, where the sun has become much more red and closer to the Earth. I think when he's actually traveling through time, the sun and the moon become almost like, they describe them as rays or like rings around the Earth, because they're moving so quickly. It's not just one ball in the sky, it's like a whole halo that's in the sky. So this really made me picture some beautiful scenes while I was reading this book, and inspired some very vivid scenes. Overall enjoyment of the story, I'd also give it a 90 out of 100. Yeah, this was even more enjoyable for me than Around the World in 80 Days, and that was really enjoyable for me. I gave that an 80 out of 100, so I'm giving this one a 90 out of 100 in that score. Also, for being such a short book with only 147 pages, this is a great book. I would definitely recommend it to anyone that's interested about time travel, space, sci-fi, lessons about class, right? The rich versus the working class, and even just culture in general. A lot of the impressions that the time traveler had about the society were changed later on in the story. He really had to spend time around the people and around the culture to begin to even understand the surface of who and what they are, which I think we can all take a lesson from. When we encounter a culture that's different than our own, we might make assumptions very quickly that definitely could be far from the truth, just based on our own limited perspective and view and our own cultural associations that we have created and made that may have nothing to do with what this other group of people use or experience. So adding all the scores together, we end up with an 845 out of 1,000. So that'll be the official Psilo score. Once again, it's 845 out of 1,000. So about 25 points higher than the last book I read. I have actually 2 quotes I wanted to share. I didn't do that for the first book, but I want to make that a regular thing where I save some quotes from the book directly that I think are important or I think should be remembered. So this is the first quote when the time traveler is talking about this world that he finds himself in the future, and he realizes that he was very wrong about his first assumptions. It says as follows: "To sit among all those unknown things before a puzzle like that is hopeless. That way lies monomania. Face this world, learn its ways, watch it. Be careful of too hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end, you will find clues to it all." And I think that can apply to more than, obviously, just this time traveler who finds himself in the future. I think this can apply to anyone in a situation that is different than they're used to, or even among a society or culture that's different than they used to. Face the world, become one with it, learn its ways, and be careful of too hasty guesses at its meaning. So yeah, I thought that was a great quote. And the second quote that I have here is this one. This one says, "It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal, perfectly in harmony with its environment, is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence where there is no change and no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have to meet a huge variety of needs and dangers." This was used to describe the upper world man, the one that I said had become so lazy or so out of touch with the workings of its own society that it was basically became like cattle. And this quote, it talks about how you need change, you need danger, you need a need in general to be able to become intelligent, right? Because intelligence is used when habit and instinct are useless. So if you're just relying on your own habits, you do the same thing all the time, it's just instinct, you're going to lose your actual intelligence to make decisions in the moment that are, case by case. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You actually need to think. You actually need to be present. So yeah, I thought this quote was important. This was another watermill classic, so I'm glad to be getting through these classic stories that I actually never read as a child or never read at all. So yeah, I think it's good that we get back to the books. They're the original source of inspiration. The older the story, the older the inspiration, I think the better. We get too caught up with a lot of the same inspirations, and there's a lot of things that end up being recycled because of that. So it's good to fill your mind with some new stories, or actually old stories, but new to this society, because we are so much on the surface. We're so much on the recycled new stories. So, yeah, that'll conclude this solo book review. Until next time, I'm still deciding on what my next book will be, so we'll have to see. It will be a surprise when I give the review for that, but it will most likely be another watermill classic, so I'll make that decision. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.